think, a little bit. Sure. I'll introduce myself. My name is Mike McBride, and actually part of this presentation, we can start here, comes as a result of a class that I teach, that I taught in punk. I went to SIU with Chris and Keegan, and when I wanted to put together a class on the punk movement, I ended up consulting them because they know comics better than I do. In terms of the punk movement, what I was interested in was this kind of period of time during the Cold War that it seems like it kind of disappeared from the history books. We have Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War II, Vietnam, and 9/11. So now Cold War kind of disappears. So, I wanted to really look at literature, the art, the film of that period, and of course music. And so that was kind of the core of the class. We were going to do zines, which are low-budget publications, magazines, or self-produced in the class, and I wanted to do text for that class that would kind of mirror that. And I think Keegan and Chris agreed. Chris ends up actually offering this book called Dinky Brown and the Holy Virgin Mary, and never read it. It's from '72. It's about a boy dealing with maturity, puberty, hallucinating that his hands, appendages, and everything is turning into penises. So, when I hear that, I go, this is the perfect fit for my class. Because the punk movement is all about penises, offensive language, and the like, and do it yourself, like Chris was talking about. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm coming from here. Yes, punk is about rebellion and revolution, but I see kind of the offensive kind of call for attention in a lot of the imagery, the art, the music, and of course the comics. I need to get a little background here real quick. There's a couple basic assumptions, and I realize these are somewhat contentious, and you can tear me apart for them later if you'd like. But one, I say the comics movement, comics with the X being underground stuff, really starts in the 20s and 30s with the 8-pagers, or Tijuana Bibles, or Jigs and Maggie books, or JoJo books, or 2x4s, or whatever regional name they have for them. I also contentiously claim that punk begins in 1963 in the U.S., and I'll kind of explain it in a minute. I know there are some purists that will say, no, the UK. Additionally, first comics with the X that kind of look like the stuff that we see Crumb do, and Justin Green and Spiegelman and those guys later, that are easily recognizable as that type are 62 and 64, The Adventures of Jesus, and and you'll see a little bit about that. Important dates, timelines, context is important, of course. So the 20s, some critics will say that the 8-pagers begin before the 20s. Some say they were alive and well during World War I, and that these were entertainment for the troops and that kind of thing. I don't know. The most important thing for me is that they are hitting full stride by the 30s and 40s when Spiegelman, when Crumb, when Justin Green are born. And so they certainly grew up with these, and I have a couple quotes that kind of back that up also. In the 40s, like I said, we have the kind of three major comics creators there. 50s, Mad Comics comes about. It's also the era of the Senate appeals against comics. That's 54, there's a couple of them that happen. And then the establishment of the Comics Code in 56. And what comes after that is as a reaction to, the Comics Code prevents a lot of, the language and the different things that people want to do. In the 60s, then we have comics proper begin, The Adventures of Jesus, God Knows Fritz the Cat, Zap Number 1, and Robert Crumb also has some fabulous titles, Jizz Snatch and Print Comics. So that's 1969. If you've never seen 8-pagers and Tijuana Bibles, this is what they look like. They almost exclusively deal with famous people, cartoon characters, actors, actresses, politicians, generally having sex, because that's, I guess, what was titillating at the time. They are generally 8 pages long, cheaply done, crudely thrown together, sold very inexpensively on street corners, usually kind of behind the counter, kind of like porn is in some places now. And Popeye was a favorite. Why he is trying to have sex with a box labeled erotic acid poison, I don't know, but that's kind of the thing we're talking about. This, the one in the upper right is Elastic Man, so that's obviously a little bit later than some of the other ones I was pointing to. But Spiegelman, talking about Tijuana Bibles and the introduction to the collection on them, says the Tijuana Bibles weren't a direct inspiration for most of us, meaning the underground comics people of the 60s and 70s. They were a precondition. That is, the comics that galvanized my generation, the early Mad, the horror and science fiction comics of the 50s, were mostly done by guys who had been in their turns warped by these little books. And without the Tijuana Bibles, there never would have been a Mad magazine. And without Mad, there wouldn't have been any iconoclastic underground comics in the 60s. So even Spiegelman saying, like, these made Mad, Mad made us, we were kind of infused by those. He further goes on to then say, and this is the quote, the fuck books were not overtly political, but were by their very nature anti-authoritarian. And I mean, you can see, it undercuts what would have been acceptable at the time for sure. And of course, anything that's somewhat subversive is automatically anti-authoritarian. And thus, in my mind, it parallels and fits nicely with the punk movement. Cut over here real quick. So this is the Adventures of Jesus, and this is God Knows. Less sex, but we do have Jesus inadvertently asking the cops for a hit of marijuana. We have God over here doing some rather sacrilegious things as well. And so you see kind of the beginning of this underground comics movement that's willing to subvert kind of, the standard comic book. And one last one. So Skip Williamson, who works with Crumb and Jay Lynch, says in this 1984 interview that one of the most important lessons about the underground comics movement is essentially a bunch of guys got together and said the comic book establishment's not going to let us publish because of the comics code. They're not going to let us do the kind of fantasies we want to put on paper. So we're going to have to go out and do it ourselves and sell them on the street corner. And that's exactly what they do. So the underground comics movement, even by their estimation, is an exact replication of kind of what was going on with the 8-pagers. And for me, it's this anti-authoritarian nature of the 8-pagers. It's the do-it-yourself kind of attitude to make it happen. And it links with the punk music. It's kind of mirroring that as well, which we'll get to here. So for me, the starting point for punk is the Fugs. And they are not necessarily a mainstream punk band. They don't really sound punk in the way that we would hear like the Sex Pistols. I'm going to say something about it in a second. But you can see, well, I can't really read the title very well. Their album is officially called The Village Fugs, sing ballads of contemporary protest, point of views, and general dissatisfaction. The song titles we have I Couldn't Get High, Boobs a Lot, We Are the Fugs, and CIA Man, which I have a very short clip of, just to kind of give you a sense of their sound. I have no idea. Not very finely polished, right? And for me, that's one of the things that really works for them. Their name, The Fugs, it was on that slide, and if you missed it, comes from Norman Mailer's 1948 novel. He used fug to substitute every time he wanted to use the word fug. So literally, their name means the. And then the other thing for me that separates them from the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, the Iggy Pop, or the MC5, is all those guys were on major labels. They were on Empire, they were on not Empire, EMI, A&M, Virgin, Warner Brothers, and those labels provided money and deserved some kind of profit. I'm not saying that those aren't punk, because obviously those are kind of our models for the most point. But the Fugs really, in my mind, embody the punk spirit. They're on an independent label, actually two of them. The first one's for folk music, the other one, ESP Disc. Their actual mission statement claims that they try to provide artists complete artistic freedom, unimpeded by any record company interference or commercial expectation. And you can imagine that did not sell an awful lot of records. So anyway, 1963, right between our two comics underground books that we're talking about. Flash forward to the 70s when we actually get to where the stuff that I want to talk about is we have 72 Fritz the Cats coming out in film form, but most importantly for my presentation, Binky Brown comes out that year as well. You also see all the punk bands down the list there, all with phallic names of some sort. Most notably the Sex Pistols, Penetration, we have the Meat Puppets, we have the Meat Men, we have the Hard-Ons, so on and so on. And as you can see, it's not just in the U.S. We have the UK, we have Australia, we have Germany. They're kind of sprinkled all around the world. There's something at that period about youth dissatisfaction that kind of latches on to this idea. We also have the album titles that are like Penis Envy, songs like Five Knuckle Shuffle, Kisses Love Gun, Wet Dream, Uncontrollable Urge by Devo, Slip It In from Black Flag, on and on and on and on and on, right? So to go back to my class that I had, my students, at the point that we get to Binky Brown, and you can start seeing some of the penises on the screen there, they've been exposed to a lot of stuff. We watched A Clockwork Orange. We've listened to all manner of punk music up to that point, including tracks such as Fuck Christmas and so on. They have, you would imagine, been somewhat desensitized, but somehow they were not. I warned them. I said, we've seen a lot of the female nude at this point. If you've ever seen Clockwork Orange, you know there's plenty of gratuitous female nudity, horrible violence, and so on. And yet, despite my warnings, they get to the point where they see our 74 penises in Binky Brown, and they are embarrassed. So much so that one of the students said that she felt like she needed a brown paper bag cover on, and felt like she couldn't read it in public. But what's interesting to me then is, and I gotta speed up to run out of time, there's 38 phallic objects in the book as well, 42 pages. So we have 74 penises, 38 phallic objects. In 42 pages, it's all packed in there, right? And what's don't make me laugh. But the critical attention about this book is focused on the phallic objects, which there are 38 of them. We're more interested in these, or the fact that it's a memoir kind of book, or the OCD that Binky Brown is dealing with, or the anxiety disorders that he's suffering with. Nobody talks about the penises, and obviously it's something that needs to be addressed. So, at the time Justin Green was writing this, there really was there was no mechanism for him to kind of deal with these issues of puberty and coming to terms with his manhood. And since he's also intensely Catholic, dealing with the guilt that he felt and worrying about sin around holy objects was a massive concern for him. So it just complicated matters. And in writing this book, for him, it really was a way of kind of purging those sins and kind of starting a conversation. We'll kind of skip down to the conclusion because I'm running out of time. But so much of the Cold War and the punk movement was about posing and posturing, feigning strength and brashness. Green bears his penis several times throughout this. One more other slide here to show you. Just a comparison of Crumb's self-portrait of himself masturbating out a window to his own sick comics, and then the more earnest, I would say, portrayal of Justin Green's Binky Brown, which is essentially a self-portrait. There's no exaggeration really in terms of proportion. Most of the underground comics, the penis is enormous. It's exaggerated to call attention to it. And just like with punk bands, they're putting it out there literally sometimes, and really trying to get people to notice or shock them. Justin Green gets lumped into the underground comics because it is an underground comic. But in terms of displaying manhood, it's a much more sensitive, earnest, kind of exposed kind of story. And it's not there just to get attention. My students were horribly off-put by the male nudity, and of course, it's not even very realistic. It's just kind of interesting. We see some other stuff later that we kind of talked about. 2 quotes quick. Patrick Rosencrantz in his ABCs of Autobible Comics picks up on this kind of idea of what Justin Green does in this comic. He says, most people prefer to deny their deep, dark secrets, even for themselves, but Green gave us everything he'd stored up: angst, nausea, sexual humiliation, and morbid obsessions. He didn't waste any time building up his ego or making himself look heroic. And I would completely agree. Justin Green in the 80s kind of has this kind of self-doubt and change of heart about his previous work. And he actually then undercuts exactly what Rosencrantz gives him credit for doing here. He says it was shocking for me to look at. I'm not particularly proud that I put so much of my internal life on the line. That he literally exposed himself in a number of ways, and critics, his church, his family, all kind of came back and kind of said he shouldn't have done that. He also then says, I think underground comics came out of a very volatile period in American history, and I would certainly agree with that. The same with the punk movement, same kind of idea there. He says it came out of a time of heavy polarization of ideas between generations, and I would agree there as well. So with punk music, whether it is by music or by art or by comic books, there is definitely something about wanting to call attention to this matter, but greater than that, talking about issues that nobody else wants to deal with for whatever reason. By not engaging his work in its entirety, and that's the title page, we somehow are missing the point. By talking around the penises and the phallic objects and everything else, our discussion of Binky Brown is incomplete. It's independent, yes, it's independently made, it's underground comics, sure, deals with these topics that are less than dinner conversation material, but it is an earnest look inside a young man's world and his attempt to understand it. Despite the church's desire to suppress it and Binky Brown's own attempt to ignore it, pretending the penis isn't there doesn't make it so.